On March 16, 1758, Father Alonzo Toreros peered over the San Saba Mission's flimsy wooden walls and saw 2,000 Comanche warriors, black paint streaking their faces, lances stretching 14 feet, arrows notched to fire 20 times a minute. 2 weeks prior, they'd swiped every horse, leaving the Apache fleeing south. Now, they weren't here to steal, they were here to kill. Within an hour, a musket ball ripped through Toreros' chest. His priests were butchered, skulls cleaved open, and the mission blazed as blood soaked the Texas dirt. This was no frontier skirmish. It was the Comanche flexing their empire's might. 240,000 square miles of untamed power. How did one man's obsession with legacy ignite this slaughter? And what happens when you plant a cross in land that answers only to the hoofbeat of war horses? Let's rewind a bit to understand how we got here. Long before Texas earned its Lone Star State nickname, it wasn't even a glimmer in anyone's eye as a unified place. Back then, it was a wild patchwork of power. First, it belonged to the Comanche, a tribe that ruled the plains with an iron grip. Then Spain rolled in, planting flags and crosses, claiming it as part of their sprawling empire. Later, Mexico took over after shaking off Spanish rule. But in the mid-1700s, when our story kicks off, Texas was still a battleground, a place where borders meant little and survival meant everything. Picture San Antonio, or Bexar as the Spanish called it, in the spring of 1756. The city was buzzing, but not with the usual trade or chatter. Tribes from Central and North Texas started pouring in, and the Apache were leading the pack. This wasn't a visit, it was a mass exodus, a desperate push south. Why? They were running from something, or someone way worse than the Spanish they'd been scrapping with for years. Spain had been trying to reduce the Apache since the 1500s, a fancy word for forcing them into Catholicism and Spanish life, stripping away their own ways. The Apache weren't having it. They'd fought tooth and nail, seeing the Spanish as little more than intruders with their adobe missions, brown-robed friars, and clanking dragoons. Back in 1744, the Spanish and the Apache Lipan had scratched out a truce in San Antonio. It wasn't some grand peace treaty with maps and handshakes. It was more like both sides agreeing to catch their breath. After years of fighting, territory, that was still up for grabs. The Apache ran Texas, or at least they thought they did, and the Spanish were just pesky outsiders. So why, by 1756, were these fierce holdouts begging for Spanish missions to push north? Simple, they needed a shield. The Comanche, a tribe they called the Norteños, because they always struck from the north, had been hammering them since the early 1700s. When the Comanche came, they didn't just raid. They brought death and chaos, leaving nothing standing. The Apache figured Spanish missions could take the heat, soaking up Comanche attacks while they slipped away south. It wasn't love for the Spanish that drove this. It was survival. The Apache still saw Spain as invaders, but invaders with guns and walls might just buy them some time. Meanwhile, the Spanish knew these tribes were at each other's throats. Intertribal warfare wasn't news to them, but they didn't get the full picture. Tucked away in Bexar, they heard whispers of clashes beyond the timberline and limestone hills of the Texas Hill Country. But the details, those stayed out of reach. They didn't know the Comanche weren't just fighting. They were erasing entire tribes. On the plains, total warfare was the game. Killing or capturing women and children wasn't rare. But what the Comanche unleashed on the Apache stood out, even in that brutal world. It was slaughter on a level that shocked even hardened warriors. Bodies piled up, villages vanished, and the Apache were losing ground fast. The Spanish priests in Bexar didn't see this up close, but they got enough letters from the front lines to know something big was brewing. They started pushing their government for more missions, thinking they could civilize their way out of the mess. The Apache egged them on, hoping for a buffer zone. But building outposts in a war zone like that? It was a gamble, and the odds weren't looking good. So, we've got the Apache running south, the Comanche tearing through the plains, and the Spanish caught in the middle, half blind to the storm, brewing north of Bexar. Enter Father Alonzo Toreros, a man with a vision bigger than the Texas sky. He wasn't just some priest saying prayers in a quiet chapel. He wanted to build a whole mission system across Texas, a network of outposts to spread Christianity and carve his name into history. To Toreros, this wasn't just about saving souls, though he'd tell you it was. He called it his gift to the world. But let's be real, it was also his shot at personal fame, a legacy that would outlast the dusty trails and mesquite trees. He dreamed of being the guy who tamed the wild frontier for God and Spain, and he wasn't about to let a little thing like reality stop him. Toreros didn't pull this off alone. He had a heavy hitter in his corner, his cousin, Don Pedro Toreros, a wealthy mine owner and a Knight of the Order of Calatrava. That's not just a fancy title. Calatrava was one of Spain's oldest military orders, founded way back in 1158. For his missionary goals, for centuries, Don Pedro had deep pockets and deeper connections, and he saw this mission project as a way to cement the Toreros family name in the annals of Spanish glory. With his cash and political pull, he gave Father Alonzo the muscle to turn his dream into something real. Together, they were a powerhouse, pushing this idea through the tangle of colonial bureaucracy. After a lot of back and forth, think heated debates in smoky rooms and stacks of letters piling up, the plan got the green light in late 1756. They'd build a mission along the San Saba River, about 150 miles northwest of San Antonio, with a presidio, a military fort, to back it up. Construction kicked off in 1757, and by April, the mission was standing. A modest setup of adobe and timber, surrounded by wooden walls. But here's where things get dicey. The presidio wasn't right next door. It was 4 miles away, roughly 6.4 kilometers if you're counting. That was Father Toreros' call. He figured having a bunch of rowdy, armed soldiers too close would stir up trouble with the natives he was trying to win over. Drunk dragoons and tense tribal folks didn't mix well in his mind, and he wanted a peaceful vibe for his missionary work. Problem is, 4 miles might as well have been 40 when it came to defense. If the mission got hit, those soldiers would be too far off to do much good fast, and in a land where the Comanche could cover hundreds of miles in days, on horseback, that gap was a glaring weak spot. Toreros banked on his charm and faith to keep things calm, but he didn't account for the kind of enemy he was facing. The Comanche weren't just raiders, they were a force of nature, masters of mobility who'd been wiping out tribes since the mid-1600s. Whole groups, names we'll never know, vanished under their hooves, either killed off, scattered to the winds, or swallowed up into other tribes. The Apache knew this firsthand, which is why they'd cozied up to the Spanish in the first place. Toreros saw his mission as a beacon of hope, a stepping stone to glory. But to anyone with eyes on the ground, it looked more like a target painted on the Texas plains. The presidio's distance wasn't just a logistical hiccup. It was a death sentence waiting to happen. The Comanche didn't care about Toreros' grand plans or his family's legacy. They saw an intruder, a challenge to their reign, and they weren't the type to let that slide. The stage was set and the clock was ticking. While Father Toreros was dreaming up his mission, another force was already running the show. The Comanche. These weren't just any tribe. They'd cracked the code of horsemanship back in the 1600s after getting horses from the Spanish. Once they did, they turned the southern plains into their playground. Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, New Mexico, Colorado, all of it. By their peak, roughly 1700 to 1850, they controlled about 240,000 square miles, or 620,000 square kilometers, a chunk of land bigger than any European power could claim. In North America at the time, they didn't just ride horses, they lived on them, fought on them, and dominated with them. The Comanche weren't playing a game of territory grab, like the Spanish or Apache might have thought. They had one goal with the Apache: wipe them out completely. This wasn't a new feud. It kicked off with serious clashes in the early 1700s. And the Comanche didn't let up. They'd hit hard and fast, often under the glow of a full moon, covering hundreds of miles to catch their enemies off guard. One night you're sleeping, the next you're gone. That's how they rolled. Their mobility was unmatched, and their ferocity turned them into a nightmare for anyone in their path. That's why the Apache started getting cozy with the Spanish in the 1740s. It wasn't friendship, it was strategy. They hoped Spain's missions and soldiers could shield them from the Comanche onslaught, or at least soak up some of the damage while they figured out their next move. The Comanche didn't care about alliances or borders. They saw the Apache, and soon the Spanish, as obstacles to smash. By the time Toreros staked his claim on the San Saba, the Comanche were already the real kings of the plains, and they weren't about to bow to a priest with a cross. By April 1757, the San Saba Mission was up and running, sitting near what's now Menard, Texas, about 150 miles or 240 kilometers northwest of San Antonio. It wasn't much to look at, a simple structure of adobe and timber, wrapped by wooden walls. But it was Father Toreros' pride and joy. He'd pushed hard to get it built, convinced it was the first step in his grand mission system. The Presidio, that military fort 4 miles away, was supposed to back it up. But not everyone was sold on the idea. Colonel Diego Ortiz Parrilla, the guy in charge of the Presidio, was dead against it from the start. Appointed in 1756, Parrilla wasn't new to this game. He'd fought native tribes before and knew the lay of the land. To him, this whole setup screamed danger and bad planning. Parrilla wasn't wrong to worry. Trouble was already brewing. From summer into fall of 1757, the Apache who passed through kept sounding the alarm. The Comanche were coming, and they weren't messing around. They painted a chilling picture. Black-clad warriors, some wearing buffalo horns, charging in on war horses with lances 12 to 14 feet long, about 3.6 to 4.2 meters, and firing arrows at 20 shots a minute. These weren't just raiders. They were a whirlwind of death, fast and brutal. The Apache had seen it up close. Villages torched, families wiped out, and they begged the Spanish to brace themselves. They weren't staying to find out what happened next. They were heading south fast. Father Toreros, he didn't buy it. He brushed off the warnings as tall tales, exaggerations from scared natives. In his mind, the Comanche were no big deal. Just another tribe he could charm or conquer. For his missionary goals, he figured a few priests, some prayers, and a sturdy cross would sort it out. Parrilla saw it differently. He'd faced tribes like this and knew the mission was a sitting duck, especially with his soldiers too far off to help in a pinch. But Toreros had the backing of his rich cousin and a head full of dreams. So the warnings fell on deaf ears. The mission stood, the Apache left, and the Comanche sharpened their lances. The fuse was lit. Things were already unraveling by March 2, 1758. The Comanche swooped in and stole nearly every horse. The San Saba Mission had dozens gone in a flash. The Apache who'd been hanging around didn't wait to see what was next. They bolted south, sensing the storm closing in. Colonel Parrilla, over at the Presidio, sent 6 to 8 soldiers to chase the thieves down. But they came back quick, wide-eyed and shaken. The Comanche are everywhere, they said. No clue how many, just that there were a lot. and they were mad. That was the first big warning, but it wouldn't be the last. Fast forward to the morning of March 16, 1758. Long before Texas earned its Lone Star State nickname. No birds chirping, no cattle stirring, just an eerie hush. He stepped to the mission walls and peeked out. There they were, about 2,000 warriors, mostly Comanche. 1,500 to 2,000 of them, mixed with some Caddo and Wichita, ringing the mission on horseback. These weren't tall, lanky fighters. They were short, stout, smeared head to toe in black paint, the color of death. Their horses were small, rugged, unsaddled, some with buffalo horns strapped on. They carried bows, lances, a few muskets. Simple but deadly. Their breath hung in the cold dawn air, and Toreros knew this was it. At first, it seemed like peace might hold. A Comanche chief rode in, calm as you please, and accepted some gifts, rice, tobacco, little tokens. For 10 or 15 minutes, everyone held their breath, thinking maybe this wouldn't end in blood. Then, at 6 a.m., it all shattered. A musket cracked, and Father Toreros dropped, a bullet through his chest. That was the signal. The killing started fast. Priests hacked down, bodies torn apart. 8 to 10 people, including 3 priests, dead in minutes. Padre Sancto Sebastian made a run for the chapel, clutching the tabernacle like it could save him. It didn't. He took 5 to 7 stabs. Then a Comanche sawed his head off with a hunting knife. Blood and brains slicked the floor, where communion had been served just an hour before. Parrilla, watching from the Presidio 4 miles off, sent 8 soldiers to help. They didn't stand a chance. 2 were cut down instantly. The other 6 limped back, pierced by arrows or lances. The Comanche didn't stop. They slaughtered every animal, 50 to 70 cattle, guts spilling out, then torched the mission, flames licking the sky. 10 people, including 3 priests, were left in pieces. Eyes gouged, scalps ripped off, bodies mutilated beyond recognition. Official counts say 2 died, but the carnage suggests more. Amid the chaos, 20 residents and 1 priest huddled in a small building, holding out until the night of March 17. When they slipped away to the Presidio under cover of dark, the mission was gone. Smoke, blood, and silence left behind. The Comanche had made their point, loud and brutal. The massacre at San Saba didn't wrap up in a single morning. It dragged on from March 16 to 18, 1758. 3 days of fire and fury. Over at the Presidio, Colonel Parrilla and his crew could only watch, stuck protecting 300 women and children, while the mission burned 4 miles away. They were powerless, pinned down by distance and numbers. After the smoke cleared, Parrilla sent word to Mexico City, begging for 500 more soldiers. He got some reinforcements and, in October 1759, went after the Comanche, tracking them to the Red River. It didn't go well. 19 Spanish soldiers died. 14 more were wounded, and the Comanche slipped away, untouched. After their 3-day rampage at San Saba, they melted back north, still lords of the plains, a grip they'd hold well into the 1800s. Don Pedro Toreros, the wealthy cousin, didn't let it fade quietly. In 1758, he commissioned a painting, Massacre at the San Saba Mission, the oldest known picture of a historical event in Texas. It's a brutal snapshot. Flames and screams spiral clockwise around the mission's ruins, a grim tribute to that bloody day. Spain's big swing at taming Texas had crashed hard. And it wasn't just bad luck. They didn't get the tribal wars they'd stepped into, and their overreach, pushing missions where they didn't belong, set the stage for disaster. The Comanche weren't some small-time raiders. They were the heavyweight champs of 18th century North America, ruling 240,000 square miles, with no one strong enough to stop them. Father Toreros' stubborn dream. Ignoring every warning from the Apache and Parrilla didn't just cost him his life, it dragged his priests and converts down with him. This wasn't just a one-off tragedy. It's a thread in Texas's wild, bloody tapestry. The San Saba slaughter shaped the Lone Star State identity. Untamed, fierce, forged in conflict. It's a story of ambition crashing into reality, of a priest who thought faith could outmuscle a warrior empire, and of a land that refused to bend. History like this isn't neat or pretty. It's raw, messy, and real. It asks us, how far would you go for what you believe in? And what happens when you underestimate the fight staring you down? That's the takeaway here. Not just a tale of death, but a lesson in pride, power, and the price of ignoring the ground you stand on. If this kind of gritty history hooks you, hit that like button and follow us for more. We're diving deep into the past, pulling out stories too real for the Westerns. Until next time, take care.